Friends of the Paris Peace Forum, bonjour, good morning, and welcome to the panel on breaking silos for the bottom billion new cooperation models to respond to the crisis. A very hands-on panel, very centered around the United Nations, global organization as well, in promoting global answers to global problems. But here we see in the COVID-19 crisis, an unprecedented crisis that has deepened and worsened the economic gaps that were already existing, inequalities, and further marginalized certain categories of populations that were more vulnerable than others. Unprecedented crisis calls for unprecedented solutions. And here we are with several projects that have been bringing a quick and unprecedented answer by being creative, by being innovative, by being inventive, in order to provide the cooperation models that traditional models might not have been able to promote in these times of crisis. With us today, four distinguished panelists. We have Mrs. Ruth Goodwin-Groon, Managing Director from the Better Than Cash Alliance. Ruth will explain to us, good morning, Ruth. You will explain to us what this actually means. Fantastic project, fantastic partnership that has developed over the years in an incredible way. We have with us as well Valérie Julien, colleague from the United Nations, resident coordinator of the United Nations in Indonesia. You have a wide experience as a resident coordinator in many areas of the world. We will devote our conversation this morning more to the specific example of Indonesia and more specifically to the Peace Hub project. You will explain to us what this all entails. Veronica Nielsen as well, head of the Global Deal Support Unit of the Global Deal Partnership, with an extensive experience in building and strengthening social dialogue. You had experience in Paris at the OECD, but also in Brussels at the European Trade Union Confederation. We will talk about how labor standards and the decency of labor standards enters into the field of these unprecedented answers to an unprecedented crisis. And last but not least, Igor Stefanovic, project that was from the World Tourism Organization, another UN body, but working as well here very much hands-on in the field with partners on the ground in Mexico on a project which aims at empowering Indigenous women in this recovery from COVID and through the sector of tourism. Igor, the project was a project of the Scale-Up Committee of the Paris Peace Forum of last year, and we will get to talk a little bit more about this in a second. Let's get to the panel discussion. I think very interesting projects, very networked in the sense of also the way the UN is trying to reach out more and more to different stakeholders and partners. If you look at the latest report by the Secretary General, Our Common Agenda, the bottom line there is the multi-layered, networked multilateralism, a multilateralism that just doesn't deal with member states, but that is a network between different stakeholders, different partners. And I think all the projects that we're looking at this morning really illustrate that philosophy, and COVID has only accelerated the need to do so. We will go for a certain 2 rounds of questions, time allowing, and then we would take some questions and Q&A from the audience that is following us. But as a start, I would like each of you to maybe give a sense of what your project is, how this project deals with the bottom billion, who is your bottom billion that your project is addressing, and what is the how does it fit into that context? What is the essence of the project? And we will then have another round of discussion where we'll go more into concrete actions and the difficulties that you may face in that project. Without further ado, I mean, Ruth Goodwin, if you would like to start maybe and give us your view on the project and how it fits in the context.
Hello, Alex, and great to be here with such fantastic co-panelists. And this topic is a really important one because we really need innovative cooperation models to address some of the challenges that we're facing, of which the pandemic has highlighted so many. The Better Than Cash Alliance is a partnership of governments and companies and international organizations that are all committed to moving away from cash, I'll talk about the problems with cash in a minute, to some form of responsible digital payment in their own markets in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. You mentioned that that is our common vision as hosted by the UN, all of us, all of our members. We've got over 80 members, governments, companies, and international organizations that are all committed to achieving the SDGs. And this is one way. And it's a very focused issue, which is the problems of cash. Let me give you the example of Bangladesh. So before the pandemic, Bangladesh is a member across the whole of government, and there are many ready-made garment factories. And the Better Than Cash Alliance also has members that are the global brands in the ready-made garment sector. H&M, Gap, Zara, you know and love them. And we also have international organization members, such as the International Labour Organization, that is concerned about better work, decent work for employees across all sectors. And so the Alliance was able to organize a huge summit just before the pandemic, bringing across the government of Bangladesh, whether it's labor or tech or central bank, across all the different players in the ready-made garment sector, the BGMEA, which is the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers Exporters Association, all the factories, all the global brands that are buying from Bangladesh, the worker representatives who are really important, the ILO, and of course the civil society organizations that are working with women's organizations in Bangladesh, because majority of the workers in Bangladesh are women. So it was the first time. So this was really innovative to model that we're talking about today, that they were all together. And then the pandemic hit. And the ready-made garment sector had to basically shut down. So there were millions of women who had no wages. And the government of Bangladesh said, we've got to do something. And so they were able to use this fantastic network, this cooperation that had happened with all the different players to make sure that every single employee in the sector was able to receive wages to keep paying her family. 60, as I said, over 60% are women. So there were over 2 million new mobile money accounts so that people could receive money, because the problems of cash are not just transparency and inefficiency and security for women. In COVID, it's a problem because you can't be socially distanced if you're transferring cash. And so it was digitizing payments was an action that they could all take together to solve this problem in the COVID pandemic. So I've got lots more examples I can share with you, but it shows how this innovative cooperation of governments and companies and international organizations together can make a difference in the lives of women, of those who are excluded, in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Thanks, Alex.
Which very clearly shows, Ruth, thank you very much for that. It clearly shows the importance of having those networks, those partnerships established for when a pandemic like the one we had hits, you're ready to hit the ground, if I may say so, and just go and give a booster to what had already been established. But we will get more into those concrete examples and maybe also see more of the challenges that you face. But let me go over to Valerie. Valerie, over in Indonesia, where you are based. What are how was the impact of the pandemic on the social cohesion in Indonesia, and what were those risks of destabilization? How does this project? What is the context in which you have been operating on this?
Hi, yes, good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm saying in Indonesia, you know, the situation is really particular in the sense that Indonesia is a very complex country, not only in terms of its ethnic composition, but also its geography with 17,000 islands. You can imagine that it is therefore very complicated. One thing that is important to remember, though, is that the government of Indonesia decided to limit as much as possible the economic impact. And therefore, there never was a total lockdown that was placed on the country, in a way that people could continue to go about somewhat with their lives. This being said, of course, there was an enormous destabilization, because although we tried to limit the impact of the economic crisis, there was one, and there was a social crisis. So actually, the pandemic impacted enormously, because it's a humongous country with 270 million people. It's the first Muslim country in the world, and also because, as we have seen in other parts of the world, the pandemic has exacerbated the existing inequalities. And for example, the gender inequalities were very much, I would say, exacerbated. We saw a rise in gender-based violence. And of course, the more some restrictions were placed on movement, the more the gender-based violence increased. And I must say, it's really a tragedy in its own right, the increase in gender-based violence. But actually, according to some research, what is interesting is to see that extremist attackers, like in violent extremism, are often united in their violent misogyny, whatever the ideology. So the fact is that this has had consequences, because what we saw is that it was an increased women participation in some event of terrorism, actually. We had in April this year an attack against a church, and it was actually a couple, a man and a woman, who actually blew themselves up in front of the church. So in that sense, this is one of the impact of the crisis, the situation of women, that has both impacted them in the sense that they were very much left behind and on the side, but also because then they were much more exposed to an amount of violence and I would say forced into some activities. But what I want to say as well is that the impact of the pandemic has been felt actually not only on women, but the same as it has been seen all over the world, but of course in a country like Indonesia, it's very visible, is that it was the people who were left behind or who were, let's say, lagging behind before the crisis that actually were the most impacted. The impact was very much on people with disability, on people in rural community, on indigenous population. But the same way the governments in the world responded to the crisis, what we saw in Indonesia is that the government also immediately activated a series of social protection mechanisms. We work as United Nations, we work with the government to make sure that social protection packages and support was not only expanded geographically, but also expanded to more people. And for instance, the majority of the business in Indonesia is actually small to micro businesses. And half of those businesses are actually owned by women. So a special support by the government was given to these businesses so that they could actually continue to function. So I must say, from that perspective, there has been a limit to the destabilization that could have ensued such a crisis as COVID. And of course, our own program, the Peace Hub, has actually focused particularly on the issue of violent extremisms, so that we could prevent a further deterioration. I can go further, but maybe let me give back the mic.
Excellent. I mean, thanks for that, and thanks for getting already in this very concrete example. I think we'll have a chance to discuss that further. Quite a dramatic picture, actually, that you've been describing in terms of those impact and social impact, which goes up to terrorism. But it sees also that the partnerships between private and public and governmental and non-governmental can actually work and provide very quick solutions if all partners do cooperate together. I think this is a perfect example there. I would like to go over to Veronique now. Veronica, head of the Global Deal Support Unit. Thank you for being with us this morning. Your project is as well a multi-stakeholder partnership. Could you give us a little bit a better picture of what type of actors the Global Deal Partnership brings together, and what are the strengths of these model in order to strengthen social dialogue and promote decent work, which is your mission?
Well, thank you so much, Alex. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. We are really pleased to be able to participate in the Paris Peace Forum. So if I just start with the bottom million that you mentioned, because well, those are the workers, whether formal or informal, that are trapped in poor working conditions. And to help them, to help themselves, we have to give them a voice. And that is why social dialogue is so important. Through social dialogue, they can make their voice heard, they can stand up for their rights, and they can negotiate better conditions. But not all workers are covered or included in social dialogue. And that is what our project tries to ensure, pushing for more social dialogue. So the Global Deal is in itself an innovative cooperation model. We bring together governments, social partners, and social partners, that means businesses and employers organizations on the one hand, and then trade unions and worker representatives on the other hand. But we also include, beyond the social partners, we also include international organizations, including the ILO, the OECD, NGOs, and even local and regional administrations. And I think that that is exactly our strength, that we are a broad alliance for social dialogue. And we believe in social dialogue as a tool to address the challenges in the labor market, as well as the consequences of the pandemic. And we are open to more stakeholders to join. We welcome others to join this initiative. Although we refer to social dialogue as bipartite or tripartite, so it's bipartite when it's the social partners negotiating, and then it's tripartite when it's social partners together with governments. But beyond the social partners and governments, other organizations can also play a role in supporting social dialogue. And just to give you one example, yesterday we published a new good practice case, which is about how to fight child labor among producers in the sugarcane industry in Belize. And this good practice is from one of our partners, Fairtrade, and it really demonstrates how social dialogue is instrumental in this fight to abolish child labor. I think also that our strength is that we offer a platform for dialogue between a multitude of different partners. So the Global Deal is a platform for peer learning, for the exchange of experience and good practices. Also, all the partners, they have to make a commitment to advance social dialogue. That is the, when you join, that is the requirement, that you make a commitment to advance social dialogue. And it is through these commitments that we then can make progress. And I just share a few examples with you very briefly. For example, the government of Spain, which is one of our partners, as part of their commitment, they developed a national plan on decent work to strengthen workers' rights and improve the quality of employment and working conditions by tackling precariousness. And they adopted a package of 75 measures to take action against temporary and part-time hiring frauds, as well as undeclared work. And the social partners have played a key role in the elaboration of the plan, and they're also involved in the monitoring and the evaluation. Another example is a Swedish company called Axfood. They have, as part of their commitment to the Global Deal, they have developed a living wage strategy to promote better incomes for workers and smallholders. Another example is the government of Colombia. They have made a commitment to share knowledge and good practice on social dialogue through the organization of several regional events. There will be a new event by the end of this month, for example. And we, as the Global Deal, we strongly believe. just to finish very quickly on the pandemic, because I think it was really important what Ruth said before about the consequences for the global supply chains. That's exactly what we are seeing as well. Orders were cancelled, workers were left without any income. So it's all about finding solutions for these workers. I'll stop there and happy to respond to further questions.
Excellent, Veronica. I mean, this is a lot, many good examples of examples that actually do work. I think in the second time, we might have also to look more into the challenges and the things that probably the difficulties that you do encounter. I mean, it's very reassuring to see that there is so much commitment also from governments. I mean, from those actors that you don't necessarily expect to commit that strongly. But we'll get to that in a minute. Last but not least, Igor, Indigenous people have been mentioned in this discussion already as one of the vulnerable groups. You're active on the ground in Mexico through this project, Weaving the Recovery. Can you tell us a little bit more how the pandemic has impacted even more Indigenous communities and how your project brings in a light of hope in that context?
Thank you very much, Alex. And I also wish to thank you for having mentored our project for the whole year, because you were our PPF mentor, and we are also honored to be here in person this year. So this question is very interesting because I need to frame it into what we call inclusive recovery, and also the socio-cultural impacts that the pandemic had on tourism and different vulnerable groups. And also wish to say that nobody is vulnerable intrinsically by being born into a certain segment or a population segment or a certain social group. So Indigenous peoples have been marginalized historically and traditionally through different exclusions that have affected their market access, also the cultural transmission within the communities, also the appreciation of their cultural capital, their human rights. So of course the COVID crisis has exacerbated all these risks and has made also Indigenous population more traditionally marginalized than before. And we have presented last year at the Paris Peace Forum this project, Weaving the Recovery, focused on the Indigenous women in tourism. We are piloting that project now in Mexico with our local civil society partners, the NGO Impacto in Chiapas and the Central for Indigenous Arts in Veracruz. And we are also working with the World Indigenous Tourism Alliance. And recently we have started working with GSMA, that is a global association of mobile communication operators and service providers, to also facilitate digital connection of these women. So the project has three main pillars. It is focused on the cultural transmission, intra-community level, that means within the community itself, but also the cultural transmission that is fostering the storytelling of the cultural capital towards the external markets and also tourism market. It's also focusing on the tourism inclusion value chain, because these women need to be included in the tourism industry value chain that they haven't been by far. And also we are focusing on fair trade principles. That should be the guiding principle of the whole project. So the bottom line of the project is to facilitate the market access of these women so they would be as independent as possible, and also to foster their entrepreneurship in the tourism recovery.
Excellent. Thank you, Igor. I think we now have a very good and broad picture of 4 projects in different areas, in different parts of the world, but that all have in common of being points of convergence between different stakeholders, bringing sometimes a wide number of actors together. And it's very reassuring, as we said, to hear that these projects do work. And notwithstanding the very difficult circumstances of the pandemic, of course, there have been some setbacks sometimes, but in a way, this seems to move on. Now, everybody knows that COVID has been particularly challenging and even more challenging in areas which are less favored than others. And you all operate in those areas. Now, it's great to see that it's working, but let's be very open. Not everything is working from day one and has been working that smoothly. So my question to you now would be, but what are the difficulties, the challenges that you had to overcome, maybe the key ones or the ones that you still have to overcome, the adjustments that you might have had to make to the original design? I imagine for you, Ruth, there had been some adjustments over time that needed to be made. But I know for Igor and the project, there has been a lot of parameters coming in. Veronica has been giving us a lot of good examples of cooperation between governments and other actors, but I can imagine some of them were more tricky than others and more difficult. It would be interesting to know. And also, I mean, from the point of view of a resident coordinator of the United Nations, Valerie, we tend to work hand in hand with the government that are our member states, but sometimes it is not as smooth as we would like. What are the difficulties that you did encounter in your respective fields? I don't know who wants to kickstart the answers. Go ahead. Anybody wants to come in first? Ruth,
I'm happy to jump in if that's helpful, Alex.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So let me give you the example of Colombia, because in response to the pandemic, the government realized that many people who had small merchants in the informal sector had their livelihoods basically stopped, and they wanted to respond. But what the big challenge was, they had to respond quickly, because when you have no income, that means you have no income and no food. And if many of them were women-headed households, and so they had to move quickly. And so the biggest challenge was moving really quickly to get across government, whether it's Ministry of Finance, Social Protection Ministry, ID, all across government, to move quickly and to work with financial service providers who needed to provide the digital payment options. No cash, not working, that's not good in COVID times. And as well as understanding the needs of those people who have been excluded from the financial sector in the past. And so the speed was the biggest problem, and it took a presidential decree to say fix this, and then all of the government's agencies were working together, and the Better Than Cash Alliance had a person in. They had a global national situation room to solve the problems quickly, and they got everything out within a month. And Togo too. We have done webinars with both Colombia and Togo, and they've said exactly the same thing. To respond quickly has been key. It's taken presidential leadership to be able to make it happen, and then to be able to say we have a solution. We can work to provide digital payments in COVID response. And now the World Bank has documented that over 200 countries and territories are doing it. But the leaders, and you can see on our website, there are webinars that have showed these great experiences of moving quickly. It is possible. The pandemic has made it possible, so that we can
pretty much shows. Absolutely. That shows, Ruth, that how essential it is. I mean, as much as there are initiatives coming, which are bottom-up initiatives, which are coming from the ground, which involve a lot of non-state partners, how important it is, though, that the state leadership gets that advocacy message and acts. I think if we go to the example of Indonesia, what I gathered from you, Valerie, is that partnership with the government was absolutely essential as well in making the project work. But I guess that wasn't sufficient either.
Indeed. And I would say in a country like Indonesia, we are in a particular situation, mostly because it's a middle-income country. So we don't enter into the category of the least developed country that had immediately a lot of attention, but neither are we a very high-income country with so much capacity. So this is really this kind of in-between situation that makes Indonesia in that situation where the government really had to step in, come with its own resources at the same time that we were providing an assistance. But what we found the most challenging in the context of the crisis of COVID is, as you know, the Secretary General, since the very beginning, put the emphasis on the very notion of solidarity. It's a global crisis, therefore that it requires a global response, and a global response can only function with solidarity. And in the context of Indonesia, the government has made a lot of effort on its own, but neither Indonesia nor other countries could really do it on their own. Hence, we needed the support of the international community. And when you think of it, for instance, the UN put together the mechanism of COVAX, which was to make sure that there would be an equitable access to vaccination to all the countries, poor or rich. And based on I would say on what the Secretary General has said, is that no one is safe until we are all safe. And actually, COVAX has shipped more than 435 million of COVID vaccines across 144 countries. But despite our best effort with that, what we realized is that there was completely a double standard in solidarity. While on the one hand, the rich country, I would say, had the rhetoric of solidarity, us from middle income and even worse, least developed country, we could see that the solidarity wasn't implemented in full, because what we noticed was that rich countries were really hoarding vaccines. So it made the challenge very important in Indonesia, because when you have such a big population, as I mentioned initially, plus a very geographic challenge I would say, send the vaccines across 6,000 islands that are inhabited out of the 17,000, well, you need to make a lot of effort. And in that case, with not enough vaccines, not enough support, that was very challenging. So as a matter of fact, the collaboration between the government, the UN, but also private sector has been essential. I must say the private sector also stepped in the context of COVID in Indonesia in order to help the situation. For instance, let me give you an example. When it comes to the vaccination, the government...
If I can ask you to be brief on this, because we're running against time. So maybe we would...
That's okay. So let me stop here and I can come back later.
Excellent. I think I just wanted to give the floor as well to our third speaker, Veronica. You illustrated a certain number of good examples of good practices. How do these build up as well to serving Agenda 2030 and the wider SDG goals as well, that I guess are also your compass in the project that you're leading?
Alex, because I can link the SDGs also with this question about the challenges, because I think one of the challenges we are in the pandemic is outreach work. How do we connect with our partners when we can only do that virtually? And we had this great capacity building program on social dialogue that we had developed, and then with the pandemic we had to transform that into a virtual program, which is great, but I do regret that we were not able to do training sessions in person, because I do think it's more effective. On the other hand, when you do it virtually, you can reach out to more people, and particularly because one of the tools that we developed, and that was together with the International Training Center of the ILO, it was a self-guided e-learning course on the 2030 agenda, decent work and social dialogue. And all these training tools are available both on our website as the Global Deal, but also the ITC for those that are interested. But so that's just one example of how the pandemic has affected our work. But so
that's an excellent one, and I think you're not the only one having had that problem. If I remember well, I mean, Igor, you were facing a similar issue, which was the lack of in-person contacts and the training. But you managed to overcome that as well in a different way. This was also one of the questions. I'm already starting feeding in some questions from the audience here, because we are being bombarded by questions, which means that people are inspired by your presentations. The difficulty also of access to indigenous communities, which is linked to this lack of in-person contacts. Over to you, Igor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, as you all know, indigenous communities sometimes lack basic infrastructures. That means like road connections, also the digital connectivity. There's problems also with antennas that would also transmit mobile phone signals. So there are many isolation issues, but we were working on purpose with communities that might be isolated from the major tourism hubs. But we've realized through the pandemic, as tourism was not recovering in the way we expected, because there were new waves of different types of COVID pandemic and different viruses. So we've realized that we had to also adjust the project to digitalization, because the digital module was not originally conceived in the project. So that's how we got GSMI on board, and we already started training last month women on digital marketing, digital connectivity, and digital skills. So they will be part also of the global e-commerce platforms and e-commerce market, because otherwise they won't be able really to sell their products. And we've also realized that it was very difficult and challenging to seek funding from the tourism companies and everybody working in the tourism ecosystem, because if you have people on furlough and your revenue is zero or even negative, you can't really cash in money to international organizations or NGOs to support new projects that haven't been started before the pandemic, because they were helping out to hospitals, to people affected by COVID, and also to the local municipalities to have patients and also even to store what was needed to be stored during the pandemic, like the equipment. So we had this backlash with the tourism sector that was not able to directly financially support, but the commitments we have is pretty big, because we've spoken with many companies like hotel chains and tour operators who would support project through training, through buying ready market products, also who would support us to organize different exhibits and fairs, to also advertise the indigenous products, and also to help us with setting up this whole value chain inclusion that needs to come afterwards, once the cultural transmission module is finished. And there are also negotiation techniques of these women to negotiate the sales of their products by fair trade principles. So these were the adjustments we had to make.
You had quite a bit of adjustments, and I guess this is common to all projects. But what is interesting here is that with the forced digitalization due to COVID and the lack of in-person, there have been some very innovative digital solutions that came up in the end. Whether this was for training, but I think we saw it also in the other examples. I mean, Ruth, with the example of the digitalization in the Cash Alliance was quite clear as well. A question as well from the audience to all of you, which I think is a very relevant one. Those 4 cases are very specific, those projects, in a specific context, geographic context, crisis context. How you've developed all in your respective areas very innovative solutions. How far are these solutions replicable? How far can they be a model for better ways of doing in another crisis context, in another part of the world, with another target population? Who wants to go on that?
I have a quick answer, Alex. My quick answer is go to responsiblepayments.org. So if you look up responsiblepayments.org, that is a global response to the challenges of rapid digitization. So we've our members said we've got to be able to document exactly your question, how good practices can be developed globally. We use everything we've learned to mitigate the risks of it. So there are 9 principles endorsed through the UN following the Secretary General's Digital Financing Task Force. So I urge you to go and see those 9 principles.
Very clear road to follow. Let me give a chance to Veronica to also come back into the game and maybe answer that question, because I guess your model is an interesting one as well that can be further developed.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alex. Indeed, I do think that our project, our model is replicable, because it's so basic in a certain way. It's all about gathering the stakeholders around the table and to try to find joint solutions together. And whenever you face a crisis, that is the most important thing to do. And before, when you asked the question about the pandemic and as a challenge, but actually it's also a bit of an opportunity, because it has really brought home the importance of social dialogue. That if we are going to address all these challenges we have, we need more social dialogue, we need more discussions, and that people are willing to find joint solutions together.
Excellent, thank you very much. Igor, from your end, how's the replicability? I mean, I think it was the essence of the project, got a little bit slowed down, but there's hope as well there.
Yes, thank you, because as we are testing different training modules, we are going to complete the whole cycle of the training modules that have been foreseen for the project. And that methodology is going to feed in the toolkit that is going to result from the project in the following months. And that can be perfectly replicable in other Latin American contexts, because of course the Latin American people have things in common when it comes to indigenous population, because they're normally related through different cultural issues and cultural factors. But we have also had very important conversations now during the Paris Peace Forum. I have met really interesting people that are working in Africa and Asia, and you wouldn't believe that from starting from a different angle, you come to the same objective and same population groups that you might be tackling through the methodology that we are using now in Mexico. So I think it has a great future when it comes to replicability, because indigenous peoples have never been so aware of their development perspectives as now. But of course, we need to also address all the COVID-related challenges so they wouldn't be so vulnerable next time when a global shock occurs and affects all their communities.
Thank you, Igor. And last but not least, Valerie, give you a chance as well to come into the game for the replicability aspect of what has been done in Indonesia. Is this something that you discuss with your colleagues, resident coordinators in neighboring countries or in countries with similar features as the one that you are representing the United Nations in?
Of course, and I want to say that the Peace Hub project that we have actually existed before the crisis. So it's not linked to the crisis, except that it has demonstrated that even in a context as severe as COVID, it functions. So it is completely replicable in another context as well as in another environment. Maybe what the key, I would say, of its replicability is because it's not rocket science, if I may say. You know, the idea is that you use first a multi-stakeholder approach where you work with the government, but also the CSOs and the communities. You know, in order to address the issue of violent extremism, you need to capitalize on the communities and their capacity. And this is true for preventing violent extremism, the same way that it is true for informing the population, for instance, about the risk of COVID. It is true for so many environments. As soon as you capitalize on the potential of communities and people, you can only have a winning solution. So I would say the replicability stems from that. And the fact that we also use all the different capacities and expertise of the UN system, and this you can really use it in whatever context. So I would say the replicability for me really stays in this component. It's important, you know, the trust in the capacity of people is a critical element of all our endeavors.
Thank you very much, and thanks for finishing on this note of trust, which I think brings us well to a very nice conclusion. First of all, I would like to thank you all very much for your very inspiring presentation. I think the projects just inspire and generate enthusiasm, and seeing from the chat, it really does. I mean, there's a lot of very positive assessments coming up, which I guess you can all see. Thank you for that, and thanks for mentioning trust. I think trust is the underlying value which is in the current strategy of the Secretary General of the United Nations. He has come back with this idea of a new social contract to build trust, and I think the project that you've been talking about, Valerie, is definitely that. But what this discussion this morning shows is that the pandemic, I mean, as an unprecedented event, brought with it the worst, but also in a way the better in this dialectic overcoming of the crisis. And it shows that the importance of reaching out, the importance of creating multi-stakeholder partnerships, of having this networked multilateralism in action is definitely the key and the path for the future. Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us this morning. We're finishing this panel now. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.